Hi everyone and welcome to Truth Over News. There's a new narrative being adopted by the DC establishment through the cooperation of their corporate media outlets. And it was most directly noted by NBC News in a new article titled, "Fears Grow that Trump will use the military in dictatorial ways if he returns to the White House." You heard that right. The latest narrative being spread by DC is that Trump will use the military to implement a full-blown dictatorship if he's elected in 2024, because, as we've been repeatedly told, Trump is Hitler. But in reality, the article is far darker than this, because the article's real point is to raise those fears of a Trump dictatorship in order to justify a no-holds-barred response to Trump's candidacy or to his new presidency, just as they did in 2016 and again in 2020. Only this time, it will be even worse, and they're working to prevent Trump from responding to the chaos that will inevitably result from his election. Allow us to explain. NBC claimed that Trump has raised fresh questions about his intentions if he regains power by putting forward a legal theory that a president would be free to do nearly anything with impunity. The article pointed to Trump's response to Special Counsel Jack Smith that, as president, his efforts during 2020 were within official presidential duties and were thereby protected by presidential immunity. However, during Trump's trial, Judge Florence Pan, who appeared to be operating from some sort of a loose script, asked one of Trump's lawyers whether a president could order SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival with impunity. "He would have to be impeached and convicted first," replied Trump's lawyer. NBC then used this ridiculous premise from Judge Pan to make the insane claim that Trump was making the case that he could assassinate political rivals so long as Congress can't muster the votes to impeach him and throw him out of office. With that premise established, NBC quickly pivoted to the real purpose of their article, a deep state call to arms. As NBC wrote, bracing for Trump's potential return, a loose-knit network of public interest groups and lawmakers are quietly devising plans to try to foil any efforts to expand presidential power, which would include pressuring the military to cater to his political needs. "We're already starting to put together a team to think through the most damaging types of things that Trump might do so that we're ready to bring lawsuits if we have to," said Mary McCord, executive director of the Institution for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection at Georgetown Law. Now, for those unfamiliar, McCord was the acting head of the DOJ's National Security Division from 2016 to 2017, and she was involved in the FBI's early FISA surveillance of Trump advisor Carter Page. McCord was later appointed as amicus curiae to the FISA court in 2021, despite her help in misleading the FISA court during the Carter Page FISA approvals. McCord was also appointed by Nancy Pelosi as legal counsel to the January 6 Capitol Security Review Task Force, and she's written multiple articles pushing the January 6 narrative. Now McCord's once again helping to direct the efforts against Trump, and she's far from alone. A number of current and former officials are now claiming Trump will attempt to use military force. Leon Panetta, who served as Obama's CIA director and then as his Secretary of Defense, told NBC that like any good dictator, Trump's going to try and use the military to basically perform his will. These claims are made partly as an excuse to further the narrative that Trump must be stopped to save democracy. But there's another reason as well. Senator Dick Blumenthal claimed that there are an array of horrors that could result from Trump's unrestricted use of the Insurrection Act. The Insurrection Act authorizes the president to deploy military forces inside the United States to suppress rebellion or domestic violence or to enforce the law in certain situations. The Insurrection Act was last invoked in 1992 during the LA riots that followed the Rodney King beatings by police. We'll return to the Insurrection Act later in the show. As this new effort continues to ramp up in advance of the presidential election, it's worth looking back at how similar efforts have been mobilized in the past. In early 2021, Time magazine posthumously chronicled the shadow campaign against Trump, a myriad of pre- and post-election actions taken by a loose coalition of Democratic operatives, grassroots activists, mainstream media, tech companies, and corporate CEOs, both before and after the 2020 presidential election. According to the article, the effort consisted of a well-funded cabal of powerful people ranging across industries and ideologies, working together behind the scenes to influence perceptions, change rules and laws, steer media coverage, and control the flow of information. Although the article treated the actions taken by this shadow campaign as necessary steps towards saving our democracy, a more objective reader of events might make the case that our constitutional republic was trampled underfoot. As the article noted, the efforts of this cabal touched every aspect of the election, including our election laws. These groups engaged in a unified legal front to change voting systems and laws at the state level, often unconstitutionally bypassing state legislatures and shifting power to the state's governors in the process. Conservative efforts to fight back against this process were euphemistically termed as voter suppression lawsuits. Any activity, position, or response from conservatives or the Trump administration were automatically labeled and then framed as inherently nefarious, even villainous. Meanwhile, a notion of false nobility was attached to every action taken by the left. Pre-election warnings from the Trump campaign and his henchmen on the risks from an unprecedented shift to mail-in ballots were, according to the article, designed to spoil the election. Conservative legal pushback against the unconstitutional changes to state election law was termed as spurious. Despite being the legal instigators, the article stated that Democratic lawyers battled a historic tide of pre-election litigation. Another focus of this 2020 campaign was to convince the public that election results would be delayed, perhaps for a number of days. These efforts were designed to condition the voting public to not expect or even accept an outcome on election night. As the article notes, the organization's tracking polls found that the message was being heard. The percentage of the public that didn't expect to know the winner on election night gradually rose until by late October, it was over 70%. A majority also believed that a prolonged count wasn't a sign of problems. There was also an effort to convince voters to expect that the vast majority of these late votes would be overwhelmingly for Democrats, a theory known as the blue shift. Democratic operatives also successfully pressured social media companies in advance of the election. These efforts were hugely successful, as large numbers of conservative accounts were deplatformed, and crucial stories like details of Hunter's laptop that might have injured the Biden campaign were suppressed, while the media simultaneously and relentlessly attacked the Trump campaign. Nor were these efforts limited to the 2020 election. In 2016, despite early efforts by the FBI and the intelligence community against the Trump campaign, Trump's win still took most of the public by surprise. But one Democrat strategist, Ben Witz, a Brookings Fellow and editor of the website Lawfare, was very worried that the forecasters were wrong. Witz was the author of a highly influential article called A Coalition of All Democratic Forces in October 2016 that discussed the need for an insurance policy in case Trump actually won the election. The insurance policy, according to Witz, was a cross-ideological network of lawyers and philanthropists dedicated to fighting Trump in court should he win the election. At the time, Witz was very forthright, writing, "If Trump wins it, the coalition of all Democratic forces needs to be prepared to see him in court." Witz later tried to cover his tracks, and these sections were edited out of his article, although they still exist on the Wayback Machine. Brookings, where Witz is a fellow, has been a driving force behind many of the legal actions undertaken against Trump. Norman Eisen, a Brookings senior fellow and Obama's former White House ethics czar, has played a primary role in the ongoing legal actions against Trump, and his efforts continue to this day in Trump's ongoing legal cases. Eisen was at the forefront of pushing obstruction charges against Trump during Mueller's investigation. We wrote a detailed article about his efforts in 2019. When he finished helping Mueller, Eisen was retained by Jerry Nadler as special oversight counsel to the Democrat majority staff during Trump's first impeachment. During this period, Eisen claimed that he drafted 10 articles of impeachment, written a month before Pelosi announced an official impeachment inquiry into Trump. Eisen also played a lead role in the June 2020 election war games, which just so happened to predict a contested election scenario unfavorable to Trump. Eisen's planning was a major part of the conspiracy described by Time. One of the primary thrusts, if not the primary thrust of the new NBC article, is that Trump will use military force against his political opponents and political protests, claiming that there may be nothing stopping a president from mobilizing the military to intervene in elections, police American streets, or quash domestic protests. It's important to note that NBC makes certain to include domestic protests, which are brought up multiple times in the article, noting that some lawmakers on Capitol Hill worry that Trump might invoke the act to involve the armed forces in the face of domestic protests. The article also mentions the George Floyd and BLM riots several different times, referring to them as the 2020 racial justice protests. Now, there's a reason that NBC is doing this. As Mike Benz notes, they're planning mass destabilizing riots of such a scale that only the National Guard can contain them, and pre-planning a way to block Trump from activating the National Guard. Give a listen.
They are planning mass BLM-style color revolution shutdowns of the country. They know the only way to be able to control something like that, where you've got millions or hundreds of thousands of people in the streets, is by having some sort of National Guard type protection of local businesses. The police are going to be outnumbered. They're already kneecapped from the defund the police movement. And so it's very clear that what they're trying to do right now is, if Trump were to win the election, the way that they would shut down his entire governance is by having pretty much his entire term be destabilized by these color revolution type tactics, and to use this, whatever they're devising right now, to stop the ability to stop those protests, even if they're burning down the country, even if people are getting killed, even if they're occupying federal buildings, even if they're occupying the White House itself.
We mentioned that Eisen's June 2020 war games resulted in a scenario white paper, preventing a disrupted presidential election and transition. That paper predicted that election results would not be known on election night due to mail-in ballots. It predicted a contested election scenario unfavorable to Trump. It predicted there would be widespread claims of voter fraud. It also predicted that if Trump narrowly lost, there would be a full-blown constitutional crisis characterized by political chaos and violence in the streets. It even predicted that Fox would call the election for Biden in a narrow Biden win scenario. Eisen's war game planning and the resulting conspiracy that came from his efforts is much of what Time was chronicling in their article, which makes Eisen's predictions of ongoing street violence by Trump supporters particularly notable. Because, despite Eisen's predictions, there wasn't widespread violence by the right, but the left was more than ready to engage in violence if Trump won. Time described what we already knew. The left controlled the activities of groups such as Antifa, BLM, and others that rioted throughout the election year. Time noted that more than 150 liberal groups joined the Protect the Results coalition, while admitting that the group's now-defunct website had a map listing 400 planned post-election demonstrations to be activated via text message as soon as November 4th, 2020. To stop the coup that they feared, the left was ready to flood the streets. There's another unspoken admission by Time as well. The trigger for the pre-planned riots was a Biden loss, not a stolen election. Angela Peoples, director for the Democracy Defense Coalition, told Time, "We wanted to be mindful of when was the right time to call for moving masses of people into the street. But after Fox called Arizona for Biden, a decision was made to stand down." Many of those organizers were part of Mike Podhorza's network, the man actually credited in Time's article as being the architect of Biden's election. As Podhorza admitted, they had spent so much time getting ready to hit the streets on Wednesday, but they did it. There was not a single Antifa versus Proud Boys incident. In other words, Podhorza and his crew effectively controlled the actions of Antifa and BLM, if not completely, then at the very least during these critical moments and days. Podhorza is an important but little-known figure. We'll revisit him another day. But as we end today's show, consider that it seems likely that plans are already being made for possible post-election unrest, and all that that implies. It's frightening to think about, but Benz may well be right. This feels like early planning or perhaps an early test designed to limit a president's ability to respond to post-election riots and violence from those who engaged in the same actions in mid-2020. Thanks for joining us on today's episode of Truth Over News.